The islands of Truk lay near the center of the Caroline archipelago, roughly 1,800 kilometers southeast of Guam and about the same distance northwest of Rabaul. Before 1941, the lagoon had been surveyed for anchorages and gradually developed with fuel depots, torpedo and ammunition stores, and repair facilities. By 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy designated it a principal forward base, home to fleet headquarters, seaplane stations, submarine tenders, and multiple airfields on Moan, Eaton, and Parham. The protected lagoon, 50 kilometers across with steep volcanic islands, gave shelter to cruisers, destroyers, auxiliaries, and transports. In Japanese planning documents, the site served two roles: a logistics hub supporting the perimeter from the Marshalls to the Bismarcks, and a dispersal anchorage for major units of the combined fleet when not engaged in operations around the Solomons or New Guinea. The Imperial Japanese Army maintained garrison units on several islands for airfield defense and coastal security, while the Navy administered the base and lagoon traffic. American strategy in the Central Pacific shifted in 1943 from attrition around New Guinea and the Solomons to a direct advance across the oceanic island chains. The United States Joint Chiefs selected a sequence aimed at cutting Japan's access to the southern resource zone and compressing the defensive perimeter toward the Marianas and Bonins. The capture of bases at Tarawa and Makin in November 1943 and at Kwajalein and Majuro in January. February 1944 enabled carrier task forces to operate from new forward anchorages. Those moves shortened flight legs for carrier aircraft and long-range patrol bombers and placed the Marshalls within striking distance of the Carolines. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's Pacific Ocean Areas Command directed the Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. Within it, the Fast Carrier Force, Task Force 58, under Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher, provided the principal offensive reach. The fleet train, oilers, repair ships, ammunition ships made sustained operations possible, reducing the pause time between successive strikes. For Tokyo, the rapid American seizure of Marshall Atolls created pressure on two linked systems: oil and shipping. The Navy's fuel came primarily from the Netherlands East Indies through sea lanes running north via the Philippines and through the Central Pacific approaches. Truk functioned as a relay where tankers could stage, where escorts and destroyers drew supplies, and where fleet units refueled before sorties toward the Solomons or Gilbert Marshall sectors. Japanese naval staff sought to maintain a decisive battle capability concentrated in carrier and battleship forces. But by early 1944, the air groups had been reduced by pilot losses and training delays, and the submarine campaign against American logistics had not prevented the buildup in the Marshalls. The combined fleet still viewed Truk as valuable, yet also vulnerable to massed carrier aviation, now operating from closer bases. Intelligence shaped both sides' expectations. Japanese reconnaissance from flying boats and long-range patrol aircraft watched the Marshalls and Gilberts for signs of a fleet concentration, but losses and fuel constraints limited coverage. American submarines patrolling the Carolines plotted ship movements into and out of the lagoon and reported anchor patterns and anti-aircraft dispositions. Long-range reconnaissance by PB-4Y patrol planes and carrier-based scouts produced photographic mosaics of runways, dispersal revetments, and shipping anchorages. Radio traffic analysis indicated periodic presence of the combined fleet staff at Truk, with peaks during late 1943, when operations around Rabaul required staging. By January 1944, U.S. staff estimates judged that Truk could host more than 100 land-based aircraft, with a higher total assigned on paper, though serviceability rates varied. The same estimates assessed the lagoon's defenses as layered: radar pickets on outer islets, coast guns covering the main channels, and an inner ring of light and medium anti-aircraft guns protecting airfields and anchorages. Public sentiment and political direction in both countries created additional context. In the United States, the costly fighting at Tarawa and the visible expansion of carrier forces generated a demand for progress, accompanied by scrutiny of operational planning. The Navy Department presented the Central Pacific Advance as a measurable sequence of base seizures that would shorten the war by isolating Japanese bastions. In Japan, wartime information controls limited detailed reporting, but the withdrawal from Guadalcanal and pressure on Rabaul had already signaled a shift from offensive operations to holding a perimeter. Truk, Saipan, and Palau appeared in official communications as elements of a coherent defense zone, tying the Carolines and Marianas to the homeland via Saipan, Iwo Jima, Tokyo corridors. Civilian shipping companies and naval logisticians understood that the Carolines mattered because convoy cycles and tanker turnarounds depended on secure staging points. Delays at Truk could ripple across the route structure, reducing deliveries of oil, bauxite, and nickel. Military preparedness at Truk in late 1943 reflected accumulation and strain. Shore installations included bulk fuel tanks, aviation gasoline storage, munitions magazines, and workshops capable of destroyer-level repairs. Airfield construction units improved runway surfaces and taxiways to accommodate twin-engine bombers and carrier-type fighters. The Naval Base Force organized anti-aircraft defense with a mix of 127mm dual-purpose guns and lighter 25mm mounts, supplemented by searchlights and fire control posts. Garrison strength combined Navy base personnel, special naval landing force detachments, and Army elements allocated to air defense and security. The exact distribution changed as units transited the lagoon. Food, ammunition, and fuel stocks were adequate for routine operations, but sensitive to convoy arrivals. In parallel, the U.S. Fifth Fleet refined carrier strike doctrine tested at Rabaul in November 1943. Pre-dawn fighter sweeps to suppress enemy airfields, followed by dive bomber and torpedo plane attacks against shipping, and sustained interdiction to prevent reconstitution. Logistics officers planned replenishment at sea to maintain a multi-day presence within strike radius without exposing oilers to land-based air. Strategic motivations converged on the same geographic fact: a large, defensible lagoon astride the Central Pacific routes. For Japan, holding Truk preserved a forward command node, a reservoir for escorts, and a redistribution point for material moving to New Guinea and the Marshalls. For the United States, neutralizing Truk promised to reduce Japanese mobility across the Carolines, to attrit shipping and aircraft that could contest the next objectives, and to test carrier forces against a heavily developed base before operations aimed at the Marianas. Both sides calculated risk under imperfect information. Japanese commanders weighed the danger of concentrating major fleet units inside a lagoon, increasingly within enemy carrier range, against the cost of abandoning a long-prepared base. American planners weighed the possibility that the combined fleet might be present and force a sea engagement against the benefits of striking primarily fixed targets and shipping at anchor. The outcome of those calculations set the preconditions for the operation that would follow in mid-February 1944, when carrier aviation and surface screens moved within range of the Caroline anchorages, and the lagoon's layered defenses prepared to meet them. On the 16th of February 1944, the ships of Task Force 58 approached the Caroline Islands in radio silence, maintaining tight operational security. The force consisted of 5 carrier groups built around 9 fleet carriers: Enterprise, Yorktown, Essex, Intrepid, Bunker Hill, and others, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The total complement exceeded 500 aircraft, including F-6, F Hellcat fighters, SB, 2C Helldiver dive bombers, and TB-F Avenger torpedo planes. Supporting them were oilers and supply ships staged northeast of Truk, ensuring continuous fueling for the fast carriers. Weather reconnaissance had reported clear skies over the target area, and Mitcher planned a 2-day strike pattern: initial fighter sweeps at dawn to suppress air opposition, followed by successive waves against shipping and installations. Then, a second-day mopping-up attack on remaining vessels and airfields. Japanese commanders were not unaware of the threat. Admiral Masami Kobayashi, commanding the Fourth Fleet at Truk, received reports of American carrier movements in the Marshalls, but underestimated the immediacy of the danger. The main strength of the combined fleet, battleships Yamato and Musashi, and most fleet carriers, had been relocated to Palau just days earlier as a precaution against sudden attack. This decision saved the core of Japan's naval striking power, but left behind dozens of auxiliaries, transports, light cruisers, and destroyers still under repair or awaiting orders. Air strength within the lagoon was approximately 365 aircraft, including fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance planes of the 22nd Air Flotilla. However, only about half were serviceable due to maintenance shortages, fuel rationing, and pilot fatigue after months of supply convoys and ferry missions. At 0445 local time, radar operators on Truk's islands detected incoming aircraft, but communication delays hindered coordination. The first Hellcat squadrons appeared over Moen at sunrise, engaging defending Zeros and twin-engine bombers attempting to climb into formation. Within minutes, air-to-air combat erupted over the lagoon. American pilots later reported more than 100 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and on the ground before noon. By contrast, U.S. losses in aerial combat on the first day totaled about 25 planes, most to flak. The initial fighter sweep effectively neutralized organized opposition, enabling the subsequent bombing waves to operate with minimal interception. Following the airfield suppression, carrier groups launched successive attacks on anchored ships and port facilities. Dive bombers struck the large transport Heian Maru and several auxiliary cruisers, while torpedo planes targeted destroyers and tankers sheltering behind the islands. Fires and secondary explosions spread across the lagoon as ammunition barges detonated and oil tanks ignited. The destroyer Shigure, one of the few to escape, later described the scene as a sea of burning fuel. Anti-aircraft fire from shore positions was intense but uneven. Many guns lacked radar directors, and ammunition resupply to island batteries was disorganized after the first strikes disrupted communications. By sunset on the 16th of February, nearly all Japanese aircraft had been destroyed or rendered inoperable. Night carrier operations commenced soon after, marking one of the earliest large-scale night recoveries in U.S. Navy history. The second day, 17th February, expanded the attack to remaining ships attempting to flee. U.S. reconnaissance aircraft had tracked movements toward the northern and western reef passages, and destroyer screens moved to intercept. Avenger squadrons attacked departing convoys, sinking multiple transports and damaging smaller escorts. The light cruiser Agano, already torpedoed weeks earlier and under repair, was among the ships destroyed. Japanese reports later confirmed over 40 large vessels sunk or disabled, with approximately 250,000 tons of shipping lost. American reports listed slightly fewer confirmed kills, but consistent estimates of total destruction within the lagoon. On land, fuel dumps, warehouses, radar stations, and airstrip facilities were systematically targeted to prevent reuse. Civilian casualties among local Chuukese islanders, who lived in villages near coastal installations, were significant but not precisely recorded. Later surveys noted destroyed dwellings and food stores contributing to post-raid shortages. For the Japanese command, the raid's impact extended beyond material loss. The evacuation of the combined fleet from Truk just before the attack confirmed that Japan's Central Pacific bastion was no longer defensible against carrier-based power. Communications between Truk and other bases were temporarily severed, forcing regional commands to operate independently until radio relays were re-established. Morale among surviving personnel declined sharply as isolated units realized that relief was unlikely. The lagoon, once a symbol of strategic reach, became an exposed liability. Logistics officers began diverting convoys directly to Palau and Saipan, bypassing the Carolines. Repair facilities that had supported destroyers and submarines were destroyed or rendered useless, ending Truk's role as a forward fleet anchorage. American forces, meanwhile, assessed the raid as a full validation of carrier strike doctrine. The ability to project concentrated air power hundreds of miles from land bases demonstrated operational reach, previously thought limited by fuel and maintenance cycles. Mitcher's staff compiled data on sortie rates, ordnance expenditure, and loss ratios to refine planning for upcoming operations in the Marianas. Analysts at Pearl Harbor noted that the destruction at Truk had effectively paralyzed Japan's inner defensive perimeter without a costly amphibious assault. The raid became an operational template for future fast carrier offensives, self-sustaining, rapid, and devastating in effect. Strategically, the aftermath shifted the balance of initiative. Japanese leaders recognized that further reliance on static island bases was untenable without adequate air cover and radar early warning. They accelerated dispersal of fleet units across Palau, Davao, and the home islands, while reorganizing air command structures to emphasize mobile defense. U.S. planners viewed the results as confirmation that bypassing fortified islands could achieve the same objectives through air and naval power alone. Operation Hailstone, as it was later designated, marked a transition point in the Pacific War, from attrition by isolation to systematic dismemberment of Japan's maritime network. Yet, for the men who fought over Truk Lagoon, the event was not merely a shift in grand strategy. It was a day when an entire naval base ceased to function, consumed by fire and fuel, signaling the collapse of a concept that had defined Japanese sea power since the interwar years. The planning cycle that produced the carrier, strikes over Truk Lagoon, combined distinct objectives for both commands, developed from different assessments of time and risk. For the United States, the 5th Fleet Staff under Raymond A. Spruance assigned Task Force 58 the task of neutralizing Truk as an operational base, destroying aircraft and shipping, and collecting reconnaissance for subsequent moves toward the Marianas. The carrier force under Mark A. Mitcher organized into 4 task groups, 58.1 through 58.4, each built around fleet and light carriers with organic fighter, dive bomber, and torpedo squadrons. The planning assumption set a 2-day window inside strike radius, sustained by underway replenishment from oilers and ammunition ships operating east of the Carolines. Expected air opposition consisted of several hundred land-based aircraft and float planes with limited radar direction. The American staff further anticipated medium to heavy anti-aircraft fire from island batteries and shipboard mounts concentrated near airfields and anchorages. Japanese commanders approached the same problem through retention and dispersal. 4th Fleet at Truk, responsible for base defense and regional sea lanes, sought to preserve the lagoon as a staging and repair node while avoiding concentration of the combined fleet's capital ships in a location increasingly accessible to enemy carriers. Combined Fleet moved its major units to Palau, while the 22nd Air Flotilla attempted to maintain an air garrison sufficient to deter or blunt raids. The plan relied on shore-based air to contest any incoming carrier strike through early warning from coastal radar, climbing intercept by fighter Chutai, and coordinated flak from ships and island batteries. Mobile surface units at Truk, light cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliaries were to sortie only under favorable conditions. Tanker arrivals and ammunition shipments were scheduled to keep routine operations viable, with the understanding that convoy schedules were vulnerable to submarine contact reports and weather. Logistics determined tempo. Service Squadron 10, recently established at Majuro, preloaded oilers, ammunition ships, and repair tenders to sustain TF-58 through repeated cycles of launch, recovery, and night steaming. Planning spreadsheets tracked aviation gasoline, bomb types, torpedoes, and spare parts by carrier and squadron, with target allotments matched to expected ordnance effects. 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs for hangars and warehouses, semi-armor-piercing bombs for large merchant hulls, and aerial torpedoes for ships underway or protected by island contours. Flight schedules built in deck cycles aiming for multiple strikes per day, front-loaded by dawn fighter sweeps to reduce attrition later in the day. Fighter direction officers integrated shipboard air search radar plots with radio control nets to manage combat air patrol, escort, and sweep elements across several hundred kilometers of airspace. Japanese sustainment reflected different constraints. Fuel for island power plants and for aircraft engines arrived irregularly. Allocation to patrols and training flights was restricted to conserve stocks. Anti-aircraft ammunition inventories were sufficient for short engagements, but vulnerable to disruption once communications and road links were cut. Repairs to destroyers and submarines relied on floating workshops and island shops capable of hull and machinery, work but not heavy battle damage. Airfield dispersion revetments existed on Moen, Eton, and Param, yet engineering capacity to expand hardened shelters was limited by material and labor priorities that favored runway lengthening and drainage. Early warning depended on a chain of lookouts reinforced by coastal radar sets with finite range in the island clutter. Doctrine shaped target selection and sequencing. American planning emphasized first-hour suppression of enemy air by large fighter sweeps at low to medium altitude to catch aircraft during warm-up and takeoff. Dive bomber groups were assigned fuel tanks, seaplane ramps, hangars, and radio stations. Torpedo squadrons targeted shipping clustered near inner anchorages and channels. Secondary objectives included radar stations, coast gun directors, and ammunition dumps to degrade command and control. The second day reserved capacity for maritime interdiction at Lagoon, exits, and for precision strikes on surviving infrastructure. Submarines were positioned outside, expected egress points to report and engage ships attempting to escape. Destroyer and cruiser groups were tasked to intercept stragglers at dusk or in low visibility. Japanese air defense doctrine aimed to preserve fighters for massed engagement under radar or observer cueing, with ground-controlled interception constrained by equipment and training. Anti-landing plans, long rehearsed against possible amphibious attack, allocated coastal batteries and mobile reserves to beaches rather than to dispersed anti-aircraft reinforcement. In practice, this left many light guns in fixed positions near airfields and ports. The base force prepared decoy barges and smoke pots to complicate aiming over the lagoon, and issued instructions for immediate camouflage and dispersal after the first alarm. Shipping captains were briefed to raise steam quickly and move to secondary anchorages or toward exits once airfields were attacked. Preparations on the American side included rehearsal of night deck operations, recognition training for Caroline silhouettes, and a communications plan minimizing radio emissions until first launch. Carrier air groups, transitioning from SBD to SB2 C models, calibrated bomb racks and torpedo settings for shallow approaches over reef water. Pilots received photo mosaics marking fuel dumps, magazines, and repair docks. Surface screens plotted bombardment fire plans that could be executed if required, though the primary concept remained aviation-led neutralization rather than gunnery bombardment or landing. On the Japanese side, preparations involved dispersal of aircraft among the three principal fields and seaplane anchorages, with maintenance crews instructed to prioritize fighter serviceability. Ammunition and fuel were staged near runways for rapid sortie generation, accepting the risk that exposed dumps could ignite under attack. Communications drills attempted to harmonize Navy and Army channels on the islands, but equipment compatibility and doctrine differences produced delays during alerts. Civil administration offices coordinated with base authorities on air raid warnings, shelter use, and post-strike firefighting assignments for Chukezi labor groups. Miscalculations influenced both plans. American intelligence judged that elements of the combined fleet might be present, and the strike schedule included contingencies for carrier and battleship targets that had already departed. Japanese estimates placed American carriers farther east and assumed a longer warning to attack interval than the dawn sweeps allowed. The belief that dispersion alone could protect shipping in a lagoon with limited exits underestimated the effect of repeated dive bombing and torpedo attacks coordinated with submarine reports outside the reef. Information policy framed expectations. U.S. communiques anticipated reporting on tonnage sunk and aircraft destroyed to illustrate progress in the Central Pacific Advance, while withholding operational details such as deck cycle timing and replenishment points. Japanese information controls prepared brief statements emphasizing continued resistance and repair capability, avoiding disclosure of specific losses or the relocation of major fleet units. For both sides, the planning documents converged on a central calculation: whether 2 days of concentrated carrier aviation could erase the operational value of a base built over years, and whether local preparations could absorb, deflect, or delay that effort long enough for strategic adjustments elsewhere. Dawn fighter sweeps initiated the engagement sequence. At first light, carrier groups launched F-6F squadrons in regimented deck cycles timed to arrive over Moen, Eton, and Parham within minutes of each other. The initial mission set combined combat air patrol relief, offensive sweeps at 3,000 to 4,500 meters, and low-level strafing to catch aircraft taxiing or with engines warming. Early warning on the islands functioned, but the alert to intercept interval proved short. Several Zero Chutai rose separately, rather than as a single mass, meeting the first wave in fragmented climbs. Radio direction on both sides was active, but constrained by line of sight and terrain masking. Within the first hour, air-to-air combat extended from the airfield perimeters to the lagoon center line, where contrails and bursts from 25mm, 127mm batteries marked turning fights. U.S. pilots reported multiple engagements with formations of 2 to 4 aircraft. Japanese pilots reported difficulty gaining altitude before contact due to previous maintenance limits and fuel economy procedures that reduced standing patrols overnight. As the fighter sweeps suppressed climbing interceptors, strike groups formed at altitudes suitable for dive profiles. SB-2 C units rolled in against hangars, fuel tanks, and seaplane ramps, aiming 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs by pre-briefed aim points derived from photomosaics. TBF/TBM squadrons approached from low altitude to release torpedoes at shipping congregated near inner anchorages. The lagoon's geography, steep-sided islands with short distances between channels, shaped runs and egress. Anti-aircraft fire intensified around the primary runways and port facilities. Light mounts created dense belts at 600 to 1,200 meters, while heavier dual-purpose guns engaged at range with director control were available. Strike leaders adjusted approach headings to avoid known batteries, splitting groups to converge on targets from offset axes, which reduced exposure to single-direction barrages. Shipping inside the lagoon attempted rapid dispersal. Captains of auxiliaries and transports raised steam and shifted to secondary anchorages or moved toward the northern and western reef passages. Tug crews cut moorings on craft under repair to clear congestion. Dive bombers struck large merchant hulls and repair ships that could not maneuver quickly. Torpedo planes sought ships underway near the channels where turning room was limited. Several oilers and ammunition ships were hit in succession, producing secondary explosions that complicated firefighting and forced adjacent vessels to relocate under attack. Escorts laid smoke and used light guns to disrupt low-level approaches, but coordination varied with the condition of shipboard radios and the speed at which steam could be raised. Airfield operations on the Japanese side concentrated on launching serviceable fighters and moving aircraft to dispersal, with ground crews towing frames to revetments as strikes approached. Ammunition parties worked under fire to supply 7.7mm and 20mm belts and 25mm magazines. Firefighting teams prioritized fuel dumps and hangars to preserve sortie potential. Communication between Navy and Army units followed standing procedures but experienced delays as cables were cut and radio nets shifted to backup sets. The base force activated smoke generators along waterfronts and key approaches to complicate aiming references for dive profiles. Outside the reef, interdiction began to shape escape attempts. U.S. submarines held positions off likely exits, reporting heading and speed of any ships clearing the lagoon. Their signals fed surface screens and strike coordinators, who retasked Avengers to intercept on-plotted courses toward the open ocean. The reef passages, while multiple, funneled traffic into predictable lines of advance that could be covered from altitude. Several destroyers and smaller escorts attempted high-speed departures, drawing concentrated attacks at the moment they committed to the channels. Hits that disabled steering or propulsion left ships drifting in the fairways, where follow-on strikes completed destruction or forced groundings on the reef edge to avoid sinking in deep water. Civilian experience differed from the base unit's tactical focus. Chukis workers employed at docks and airfields moved to shelters or assisted firefighting details under local administration direction. Villages near coastal installations received damage from fragments and fires spreading from fuel and warehouse areas. Fishing and inter-island transport halted, and community leaders organized food distribution from unaffected stores. Casualty reporting for civilians proved imprecise during the raid, due to disruption of medical and administrative offices. Later, tallies incorporated hospital lists and village records to estimate deaths and injuries attributable to direct hits, secondary fires, and accidents during evacuation. By late morning of the first day, organized air opposition had declined. Japanese pilots who reached altitude engaged in smaller, isolated fights against numerically larger Hellcat formations. Losses on both sides included aircraft destroyed in combat and by operational causes, landing accidents on damaged runways and ditchings near carriers whose decks were operating at sustained tempo. U.S. strike coordination improved with each cycle as fighter directors integrated contact reports from picket destroyers and returning sections. Japanese ground controllers shifted emphasis to conserving surviving aircraft and moving them between fields during lulls to avoid predictable strike timing. The lagoon's hydrography influenced terminal effects. Shallow areas near moorings allowed some crews to ground damaged ships intentionally, preserving personnel and equipment for potential salvage. Deeper anchorages recorded complete sinkings, with masts and superstructure remaining visible at low tide. Oil slicks expanded across the central basin, and burning fuel created smoke columns that obscured subsequent aim points, forcing pilots to rely on pre-planned headings and time over target sequencing rather than visual references. Shore parties attempted to curtain oil fires with foam and water lines drawn from limited pumping stations, but power fluctuations interrupted flow. In parallel with attacks on shipping and airfields, secondary targets came under systematic pressure. Radar stations on outlying islets were struck by dive bombers, and communications huts along ridgelines received strafing runs to sever remaining cable links. Coast artillery positions engaged only sporadically, constrained by line of fire and masking by terrain and smoke. Ammunition magazines inland suffered detonations when struck, affecting nearby roads and making movement between installations more difficult. Repair shops and machine facilities that supported destroyer and submarine maintenance experienced direct hits that damaged lathes, cranes, and electrical gear, reducing the base's capacity to return ships to service. Morale responses diverged. U.S. Air Group reports noted rising confidence as the rate of interception fell and strike accuracy improved with repeated runs. Japanese base logs recorded periods of heavy action interspersed with communications outages, during which local commanders operated on fragmentary information and prioritized immediate survival tasks, firefighting, casualty evacuation, and protection of remaining fuel. Orders to disperse shipping and aircraft remained in force, but congestion, damage to tugs and barges, and continued strikes limited execution. Command posts re-established contact via alternate circuits, issuing updates on runway status and advising which fields remained usable for emergency landings. By sunset, both sides adjusted for night. Carrier decks transitioned to recovery under reduced lighting, with night-qualified crews shepherding damaged aircraft. Destroyer screens tightened around the carriers while maintaining radar pickets oriented toward the Carolines. Within the lagoon, Japanese crews used darkness to move surviving ships to less exposed anchorages and to evacuate wounded to improvised aid stations. Searchlights probed smoke and haze over airfields as repair parties worked to clear debris from runway surfaces. The first engagements had concluded without amphibious landings or shore bombardments, but the operational effect was cumulative. Air defense capacity had been reduced, shipping was scattered or disabled, and the base's internal circulation, roads, cables, fuel lines, had been disrupted in multiple sectors. The conditions set by these initial clashes governed the pattern of the next day's interdiction and the scope for any counteraction emerging from remaining assets inside and beyond the lagoon. The second day widened the scope of action and introduced cumulative stresses that neither side could fully control. Before sunrise, carrier groups adjusted launch intervals to exploit the first day's mapping of flak concentrations and to cover exit routes where ships might attempt departures under darkness. Fighter directors redistributed patrol boxes to guard against any last-ditch sorties from surviving airframes and to escort strike packages to more distant waypoints beyond the lagoon. Weather over the Carolines produced broken cumulus between 900 and 1,800 meters, with intermittent squalls. These conditions complicated bomb runs but also masked approach vectors, permitting staggered arrivals that limited the defenders' ability to mass fire. Japanese headquarters on the islands issued orders to conserve aircraft for selective engagements and to allocate remaining ammunition, primarily to defensive airfields and harbor entrances. Maintenance crews concentrated on a smaller set of fighters and reconnaissance planes that could be turned around quickly. The base force reorganized anti-aircraft sectors after overnight damage assessments revealed cut cables, disabled directors, and ammunition dumps exposed by earlier hits. Civilian labor continued to assist in moving munitions and fuel, while local administration directed distribution of rice and preserved foods away from waterfront storage. Telephone lines linking island posts were spliced where possible. When not, runners and short-range radio sets bridged gaps with delays measured in hours, tens of minutes, rather than seconds. Escalation manifested first in maritime interdiction. At dawn, reconnaissance flights located clusters of ships edging toward northern and western passages, some with tug assistance, others under their own power with limited steerage. Strike leaders routed Avengers to attack egress points, while Helldivers focused on vessels still at anchor with visible deck cargo, or cranes rigged for cargo movement. Dive profiles shifted to steeper angles to minimize time in 25mm envelopes that had proven most dangerous at low altitude on the first day. Several vessels grounded deliberately on inner shoals after sustaining damage, creating navigational obstacles that forced later departures into narrower channels. Smoke generators and ad hoc fires used as concealment on shore created patches of reduced visibility. In response, strike timing spaced arrivals to avoid stacking over the same target areas. Command challenges grew. For Task Force 58, sustained deck cycles pushed crews and machinery. Arresting gear required rapid inspection between recoveries, and some carriers rotated squadrons to maintain pilot endurance standards. Fuel and ordnance transfers from oilers and ammunition ships took place underway at set distances east of the target area. Replenishment officers tracked expenditure rates against remaining daylight windows to preserve a reserve for unanticipated targets. A handful of returning aircraft ditched near the task groups due to battle damage or a fuel miscalculation, drawing destroyers off picket lines for rescue before rejoining screens. Night flying experiences from the first day informed revised recovery lighting procedures to reduce landing accidents under residual haze. On the Japanese side, the crisis was multidimensional. Decision-makers balanced the imperative to preserve personnel against orders to maintain the base as a functioning node. Some ships with higher-value cargoes or specialized repair capability attempted exits despite risk, while less critical hulls remained as floating storage or sources of spare parts. Shore authorities prioritized repair of one runway at a time to enable limited movement of aircraft between fields during lulls. Bulldozers and manual labor cleared crater lips and debris, while engineers patched surfaces with compacted fill. Anti-aircraft units redistributed surviving guns to cover previously under-defended approach sectors, but ammunition stocks for certain calibers fell below planned allotments. Communications units improvised antenna masts after strikes toppled original structures, reducing range and clarity. Casualty management strained resources. Naval clinics and Army medical stations admitted wounded from ships and shore installations. Triage emphasized burns, blast injuries, and shrapnel wounds. Chuukese volunteers assisted stretcher parties and established additional shelters in caves and concrete-lined storage spaces. Water supply became a concern after power interruptions affected pumping. Fire control efforts sometimes diverted potable reserves to firefighting lines. Several days, but required redistribution as waterfront warehouses suffered damage. The civil administration compiled village-level lists to coordinate rations and to account for displaced persons from damaged coastal settlements. Political and strategic pressures amplified the local crisis. Radio contact with higher commands acknowledged the scale of the attack without detailed loss reporting. Requests for reinforcement of fighter strength and anti-aircraft ammunition competed with broader theater priorities in Palau and the Marianas, where planning for future operations demanded concentration of air assets. Orders emphasized continued resistance, but the parallel directive to avoid attritional losses of scarce pilots yielded conservative launch decisions. The combined fleet's earlier relocation limited options for sortie by heavy units to challenge the carrier force. Submarine activity by the United States outside the reef produced additional constraints on outbound traffic, with contact reports guiding new strike assignments and causing delays as captains waited for lulls before committing to channels. For the Americans, the widening interdiction required coordination beyond individual carrier air groups. Strike coordinators integrated submarine contacts, visual sightings from scout planes, and radar plots from picket destroyers to shape attack sequences on moving targets. Surface commanders considered limited night surface actions near exits but held to aviation as the primary tool, given the risk of shoal waters and uncertain charting near the reef edge. Bomb damage assessment relied on overlapping sources, pilot reports, photography, and submarine verification. Discrepancies in claimed sinkings were noted for later reconciliation, but operationally the emphasis remained on denying movement and destroying port function. Terrain and infrastructure amplified the crisis. Damage to machine shops and powerhouses degraded the base's ability to repair pumps, cranes, and rolling stock. Road cuts and crater junctions slowed movement of ammunition, trucks, and firefighting rigs, increasing exposure times in open ground. Radar coverage from outlying islets degraded as sets were destroyed, or as generator fuel ran low. Visual observers filled gaps with later and more localized warnings. Smoke from fuel and lubricants created a persistent haze layer that interfered with optical sighting for both defenders and attackers, leading to more reliance on pre-briefed headings, stopwatch timing, and radioed corrections from strike leaders already over target. Morale under escalation showed mixed indicators. U.S. squadron logs recorded a decline in organized air opposition and a shift in losses toward flak and operational accidents, which crews interpreted as confirmation that the suppression plan was working. Maintenance personnel, however, noted rising fatigue and the need for cannibalization of parts to keep sortie rates high. Japanese logs reflected determination among anti-aircraft crews and firefighting parties, but also documented ammunition rationing, repeated relocations of command posts, and intermittent uncertainty over higher headquarters intentions for the base. Civilian accounts described adherence to shelter drills and cooperation with base authorities, combined with concern over harvest preservation and inter-island transport once the raid ended. International implications entered staff assessments even as operations continued. U.S. planners judged that the reduction of Truk's capacity would shorten timelines for moves toward the Marianas by reducing the risk of counterstrike from the Carolines. Japanese staff recognized that convoy routing would need to bypass the lagoon, increasing voyage lengths and exposing tankers and freighters to different threats along the Philippines and Western Carolines. The second day's strikes, therefore, were not only tactical engagements, but also mechanisms to enforce a strategic realignment of shipping patterns. By late afternoon, the pattern of escalation had a discernible rhythm. Fighter sweeps suppressed any attempt at assembly over airfields. Helldivers and Avengers executed attacks on ships at anchor and in transit. Secondary flights hit fuel storage, radio stations, and radar. Submarines and surface screens tightened the cordon around exit routes. Inside the lagoon, base authorities concentrated surviving assets in sectors less exposed to direct approach, while medical and civil services expanded improvised facilities. The cumulative effects, airfield degradation, navigational obstacles, reduced ammunition stocks, and intermittent power shifted the defenders from active denial toward endurance. For the attackers, maintaining pressure without overextending logistics and pilot stamina became the primary command problem. The crisis phase concluded not with a discrete event, but with a measurable reduction in the defenders' capacity to contest or to evacuate, setting conditions for the largest destructions and the final suppression tasks that would follow in the peak period of the operation. The peak of the operation arrived as carrier air groups executed the most concentrated strike cycles of the campaign, compressing reconnaissance, attack, and interdiction into overlapping sorties. Afternoon missions on the second day shifted from broad suppression to target sets prioritized by mass and function. large merchants, oilers, ammunition carriers, and repair ships, whose loss would remove the lagoon's capacity to support subsequent movements. Strike leaders synchronized hell divers and avengers so that dive-bombing forced ships to maneuver into torpedo approach lanes, while fighters suppressed light guns and strafed bridge areas to disrupt helm orders. Coordinators allocated altitudes and ingress headings to reduce mutual interference, with timing intervals calculated against known reload rates of 25mm batteries. Multiple ships struck during earlier cycles were selected for re-attack to ensure disablement rather than damage alone, producing cumulative effects as fires spread and buoyancy decreased. Critical losses occurred in quick succession. Aikoku Maru, carrying supplies and personnel, suffered a detonation after bomb impact that destroyed the forward section and caused heavy casualties. Heian Maru, a large auxiliary with repair capability, was repeatedly hit and sank after fires reached internal compartments. Among tankers, Hoyo Maru was set ablaze, removing aviation gasoline reserves needed for air operations and motor transport. The destroyer Oiti, engaged in movements between anchorages and later attempting exit, was struck and broke apart with severe personnel loss. Additional Maris, Yamagiri Maru, Fujikawa Maru, and others used as cargo and aviation stores carriers were hit or sunk in anchorages or near exits. Each hull carried specific equipment, torpedoes, aircraft components, or general stores, whose destruction reduced the base's ability to repair, rearm, and sortie, even if airfields could be restored. High command decisions framed the intensity of this period. Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher authorized repeated re-attacks on burning targets when ordnance remained, trading sortie count for assured neutralization of key logistics nodes. Fighter direction shifted from wide-area sweeps to close escort and strafing suppression over the densest anchorage clusters. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance retained the fast battleships and cruisers in a covering posture rather than conduct shore bombardment, avoiding navigation in confined waters while preserving ammunition for possible surface contact outside the reef. On the Japanese side, 4th Fleet Headquarters ordered concentration of anti-aircraft around functioning piers and airstrip approaches, instructed captains to ground damaged ships in shallow areas to enable later salvage, and directed limited evacuation of technical personnel by small craft toward less exposed islets. Requests for reinforcement could not be met rapidly. Available aircraft at Palau and other bases were allocated to theater defense priorities and to the protection of convoy routes beyond the Carolines. At the height of the strikes, air operations on both sides reflected maximum effort within constraints. U.S. carriers cycled aircraft at short intervals, maintaining a continuous presence over the lagoon. Ordnance crews brought forward 500-pound general-purpose bombs, semi-armor-piercing bombs for merchant hulls, and aerial torpedoes set for shallow runs over reef water. Maintenance sections kept sortie rates high by cannibalizing marginal aircraft and rotating damaged airframes to rear of deck spots for later repair. Japanese ground crews concentrated on keeping a reduced number of fighters serviceable to contest approach lanes at medium altitude, while seaplane tenders attempted to move surviving reconnaissance aircraft to sheltered moorings. Anti-aircraft batteries exploited known approach corridors, and several Avengers and Helldivers were lost to concentrated bursts over the inner anchorages and runway perimeters. Comparative losses during the peak showed a widening disparity. American claims recorded dozens of ships sunk or afire, and over 200 aircraft destroyed in air and on the ground across the 2-day period, while U.S. aircraft losses, including combat and operational accidents, remained in the tens. Japanese reports tallied significant personnel casualties among ship crews and base units, with surviving aircraft numbers falling below thresholds needed for coordinated interceptions. Civilian conditions reached their most difficult phase. Chukisi communities near port facilities experienced blast and fire damage from secondary explosions, and smoke drift affected inland villages. Local administrators, working with base authorities, organized movement to caves and reinforced shelters, assigned firefighting and water-carrying details, and redistributed food from undamaged stores. Fishing ceased and inter-island canoe traffic was restricted by order to prevent movement during attack windows. The hospital on Moen and smaller aid stations on other islands treated mixed naval and civilian casualties. Shortages of dressings and antiseptics developed as admissions rose. Water supply was intermittently cut when powerhouses lost output, forcing reliance on cisterns and hand pumps. Despite displacement, record-keeping continued in simplified ledgers, noting names, injuries, and relocations, with later reconciliation used to estimate civilian loss of life. Nightfall during the peak did not end activity. U.S. destroyers maintained radar pickets and closed to recover downed aircrew, while carriers executed night recoveries under reduced lighting. Scouts marked fires and silhouettes for first light attacks on surviving targets that had shifted position after dark. Inside the lagoon, Japanese crews used the night to tow damaged vessels toward shoal water, to jettison munitions at risk of detonation, and to move wounded personnel to aid stations. Engineers continued runway repair under blackout conditions, filling craters and clearing debris to keep at least one strip on each principal island marginally usable for emergency movements. Communications units re-established links over secondary circuits to issue updated anti-aircraft firing plans and to coordinate ammunition distribution from surviving magazines. The climax of destruction extended into the following morning when improved visibility allowed confirmation and final suppression of previously damaged hulks. Strike photography documented multiple ships sunk in deeper anchorages, with oil slicks and wreckage fields extending across the central basin. Submarines outside the reef reported few successful escapes and directed aircraft to isolated vessels attempting late departures. Within command diaries, American staff assessed that Truk's role as a forward repair and logistics base had been eliminated for the near term. Japanese base logs recorded that continuous operations were no longer possible without external resupply and major repair effort. No amphibious landings followed. The operation's purpose remained neutralization rather than occupation. Operational learning at the peak shaped subsequent doctrine. For the U.S. Navy, the coordinated use of fighter sweeps, dive, and torpedo attack, submarine queuing at exits, and real-time strike control validated the fast carrier model for neutralizing heavily developed island bases without committing to shore assault. Observations on flak envelopes, bomb fusing against merchant structures, and torpedo performance in shallow, reef-influenced waters entered after-action studies used for the Marianas and later operations. For Japanese commands, the experience confirmed that fixed-base defense without robust early warning and replacement air strength could not prevent the systematic reduction of a major anchorage. Orders issued after the raid emphasized dispersal of shipping to multiple secondary anchorages, reduction of visible stockpiles near waterfronts, and relocation of repair capability toward areas beyond carrier radius. By the end of the peak period, the measurable situation was clear in comparative terms. Shipping losses in the lagoon reached well over 150,000 tons, with confirmed sinkings across transports, oilers, and auxiliaries. Aircraft destroyed numbered in the hundreds across 2 days. American aircraft losses were limited relative to sorties flown, with the majority attributed to anti-aircraft fire and operational causes rather than air-to-air combat. The base's capacity to refuel, rearm, and repair transiting units had been removed. Civilian infrastructure suffered damage unevenly, with coastal settlements affected most, and inland agriculture largely intact but facing distribution challenges. These outcomes closed the most intense phase of the operation and defined the conditions under which both commands would adapt. One to exploit the removal of a key node along Central Pacific routes, the other to sustain garrison life and limited local defense in a lagoon no longer functioning as a fleet anchorage. Resistance after the peak took practical forms shaped by what remained. On the islands, base authorities assembled working parties to clear runways, move ammunition from damaged magazines, and redistribute surviving anti-aircraft guns to cover approach sectors that had proven vulnerable. Technicians used spare barrels and salvage breaches to return several 25mm mounts to action. A smaller number of 127mm dual-purpose guns were reconnected to improvised directors powered by portable generators. Aircraft serviceability was counted in low dozens. Priority went to fighters that could climb quickly to medium altitude for short intercepts timed between strike cycles, while 2 or 3 reconnaissance float planes were kept ready for local search at dawn or dusk. Ground crews concentrated remaining aviation gasoline near the least damaged strip and rationed sorties to minutes rather than hours, accepting that surviving aircraft would operate within a tight envelope dictated by fuel stocks and battle damage to runways. Adaptation at sea was similarly constrained. Ship captains who had grounded damaged holes on inner shoals directed salvage teams to rig temporary patches, pump out compartments with portable units, and shift ammunition to barges to reduce risk of detonation. Engineers cut holes to vent fires and preserve buoyancy where possible. Crews on less damaged auxiliaries repositioned to anchorages screened by island contours and smoke, using camouflage nets and paint to break silhouettes visible from altitude. Tug operators prioritized vessels carrying repair equipment, aviation stores, or fuel transfer gear because their survival would preserve limited base function even if most transports were lost. The Japanese command issued directives to classify ships by criticality. Tankers, repair hulks, and radio relay craft were to be saved first. General cargo craft were to be used as decoys or fueled only if exits were clear. American adaptation focused on sustaining pressure while minimizing avoidable loss. Fighter direction centers afloat adjusted patrol geometry to block short intercepts and to escort strike groups at altitudes that balanced fuel consumption with protection. Squadron leaders revised ingress headings to account for new smoke patterns and the shifting positions of surviving guns. Avenger crews altered torpedo drop parameters based on observations of shallow reef water and crosswinds. Drops were made at lower speed and altitude with spacing to avoid mutual wake interference. Helldiver formations employed split-second interval releases on elongated targets like repair ships and tankers to increase probability of at least one critical hit. Pilots returning with damage were recovered using refined night lighting procedures and improved signals from landing signal officers, reducing operational losses relative to earlier night cycles. Resource management on the islands took on a civilian dimension. Chukasi administrators and village leaders, coordinating with base authorities, redirected water from damaged main lines to cisterns and manually filled drums placed at shelters and aid stations. Fishing remained suspended during daylight and was restricted to sheltered inshore waters during lulls to avoid exposing canoes to debris and oil films. Food distribution moved away from waterfront warehouses to inland storehouses, with inventory lists kept in simplified ledgers when formal offices were unusable. Local labor assisted in runway clearance and firefighting, while older residents and children, sheltered in caves or concrete storage rooms, identified during pre-war surveys. Civilian casualties continued to be recorded by name when possible, with the understanding that later reconciliation would be required once communication stabilized. Countermeasures sought to raise the cost of each subsequent strike rather than to reverse the overall situation. Anti-aircraft sectors were redrawn to produce overlapping fire at set altitudes, and ammunition was rationed to avoid expenditure against decoy approaches. Smoke pots were repositioned to align with prevailing winds. False fires were set inland to draw aim points away from waterfront tanks and piers. Radio deception was limited by equipment availability, but included intermittent transmissions from secondary sets to suggest continued control from previously struck command posts. Shore parties erected dummy radar masts and placed empty fuel drums in patterns resembling storage dumps to absorb initial bomb runs. Captains of surviving ships timed movement to coincide with cloud cover or to follow immediately behind major strikes, calculating that strike coordinators would need minutes to retask aircraft. U.S. forces integrated additional cues to maintain interdiction. Submarines off the reef exits provided contact reports with ranges and bearings that allowed strike leaders to plan intercepts against outbound courses. Picket destroyers refined radar filters to separate sea clutter from small craft attempting to slip through passages. Photo interpreters aboard carriers compared mid-mission imagery with previous mosaics to identify hulls that had shifted position or that displayed new smoke types indicative of operational fuel rather than residual fires, a sign of attempted departure. Dispatch officers on ammunition ships adjusted loadouts, increasing the proportion of general-purpose bombs relative to semi-armor-piercing munitions, once it became clear that many targets were unarmored merchant ships and repair hulks. Psychological adaptation emerged on both sides. American air crews reported reduced anxiety during ingress as organized interceptions diminished, but maintenance personnel recorded fatigue and a growing backlog of marginal airframes that required full overhaul beyond the capacity of the task groups at sea. Japanese crews noted discipline in firefighting and gun crews despite rationed ammunition and repeated relocations of command posts. Deference to standing orders coexisted with local initiative, such as towing barges loaded with scrap metal into open areas to draw bombing runs, or moving key radio sets to small boats anchored under overhanging foliage. Civilian accounts documented adherence to shelter routines and the use of extended family networks to aggregate food and care for wounded relatives. Beyond the lagoon, adaptation became strategic. Japanese shipping routes were re-examined to reduce reliance on the Carolines as a relay. Convoys were directed to stage through Palau, Davao, and the Marianas, lengthening voyages but avoiding the interdicted lagoon. Escort allocations shifted accordingly, with destroyers and Kaiboken assigned to routes where submarine threat was highest. Air staff in Palau and the Philippines began dispersing aircraft to satellite strips and increased emphasis on night training to match anticipated American strike patterns. At the same time, the combined fleet retained heavy units away from fixed anchorages judged to be within sustained carrier radius, emphasizing mobility and refit in deeper rear areas even at the cost of longer response times. American planners converted operational lessons into near-term adjustments. Sortie rates were recalibrated to align with replenishment schedules and pilot endurance, accepting slightly fewer sorties in exchange for sustained quality of execution. Strike coordination formalized the role of airborne controllers in assigning targets dynamically based on visual and photographic input, a practice that would be carried into later operations. The balance of fighter-to-bomber sorties was adjusted in the afternoon toward strike escort and strafing suppression rather than area sweeps, reflecting the reduced likelihood of massed aerial opposition and the continued threat from flak around port facilities. Measures of resistance and adaptation are reflected in comparative figures assembled during and after the operation. Japanese aircraft available for defense declined from several hundred assigned to low dozens, serviceable by the end of the second day, with sorties constrained by runway damage and fuel. Ships sunk or disabled reached scores of holes with tonnage totals exceeding 100,000. A fraction grounded in shallow water were designated for later salvage. American aircraft losses, while significant at unit level, remained low relative to roughly 1,000 sorties across the period. The majority were attributed to anti-aircraft fire and operational causes rather than air-to-air combat. Civilian displacement numbers rose as coastal settlements moved inland temporarily. The precise counts varied by island, but records indicate a persistent need for water purification and shelter maintenance rather than complete depopulation. In the closing hours of the adaptation phase, both commands acted with an eye to the near future. Surviving Japanese aircraft were dispersed or hidden for preservation. Key technical personnel were moved to less exposed islets, and signals were sent to higher command, requesting replacement parts and ammunition with priority codes. U.S. task groups set conditions for withdrawal on schedule by coordinating late strikes against targets documented as reparable, aiming to deny immediate recovery of port function. The lagoon remained contested in detail, but decided in its larger function. Base personnel could resist and mitigate, and some ships could be salvaged, yet the operational network that made Truk a forward logistics and repair hub had been dismantled, forcing both sides into new patterns for the campaigns that would follow. The turning point emerged not as a single strike, but as a sequence of decisions taken under the pressure of evidence collected during and immediately after the raids. Aerial photographs processed aboard the carriers and compared to pre-attack mosaics showed airfields with crater patterns that rendered quick restoration unlikely. fuel tanks ruptured in multiple clusters, and distinct wreck fields in the principal anchorages. Submarine reports from outside the reef confirmed that only a limited number of ships had cleared the passages. When staff officers reconciled pilot claims with imagery and submarine sightings, they identified a consistent order of magnitude: more than 40 large vessels sunk or permanently disabled, with tonnage well above 150,000 and in several tallies near 200,000 to 300,000. Aircraft losses on the Japanese side exceeding 250, destroyed in air and on the ground. U.S. aircraft losses across 2 days in the range of 2 to 4 dozen, the majority to anti-aircraft fire and operational causes. While precise counts would remain under review, the disparity in capacity lost versus expended became the fulcrum for subsequent choices. For the American command, the first decisive choice was to treat Truk as neutralized for the purposes of the Central Pacific timetable, rather than to schedule a follow-on amphibious seizure. Admiral Raymond Espruance and Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher interpreted the reconnaissance as proof that carrier aviation, submarine screens, and underway logistics could eliminate a major forward base without committing assault troops. Operations planners reallocated bombardment ammunition and amphibious shipping, earmarked in earlier contingency drafts toward upcoming objectives in the Marianas. Service Squadron 10 adjusted replenishment cycles to support rapid turnarounds between the Carolines and staging points at Majuro and Kwajalein, accepting a shorter maintenance window in exchange for maintaining pressure across the theater. Intelligence sections recommended continued episodic strikes to prevent repair, but they no longer advocated sustained operations focused on Truk. Attention shifted to Palau, the Marianas, and convoy routes through the Philippines. On the Japanese side, the turning point consisted of accepting that Truk could no longer function as a fleet anchorage or as a reliable relay for tankers and escorts. Fourth Fleet transmitted revised standing orders that emphasized conservation of surviving personnel and equipment, emergency salvage of grounded ships, favored for later parts recovery, and redistribution of anti-aircraft guns to protect essential services rather than to build a unified flak belt, already compromised by cratered access roads and power loss. Combined fleet directives moved staging for heavy units to Palau and farther west, with instructions that capital ships and fleet carriers avoid prolonged stays within reach of massed carrier aviation. Convoys were rerouted via the Western Carolines and the Philippines, increasing voyage length and exposure to submarine patrol lines. Air staff recognized that replacement aircraft could not be concentrated at Truk without repeating losses. Surviving pilots and maintenance specialists were earmarked for other bases where runways and radar remained intact. These adjustments had immediate operational effects. American submarines on lines south and west of the Carolines reported increased traffic along alternative routes, which in turn shaped patrol allocations and attack opportunities. Carrier planners integrated these changes by scheduling reconnaissance toward Palau and Yap, calibrating new strike packages for lagoon geography and port layouts different from Truk's. On the islands, Japanese base authorities shifted from trying to reconstitute full sortie capability to maintaining minimum communications, medical care, and water supply. Salvage became a structured activity. Technical teams surveyed grounded holes for engines, pumps, guns, and fittings that could be removed and sent by small craft to other garrisons. Shore parties dismantled damaged aircraft for usable components. The lagoon changed from a forward logistics hub into a source of material to support defenses elsewhere. Civilian administration also crossed a threshold. Local leaders and base officials jointly established longer-term food and water distribution routines, recognizing that shipping schedules would be irregular. Fisheries resumed on a limited scale in sheltered areas after oil slicks dispersed locally, with catch inspected for contamination, and reserved for village-level consumption rather than port rations. School and religious buildings outside blast zones were designated as semi-permanent shelters, and record-keeping standardized to track displaced families, the distribution of rice and taro, and the movement of patients between aid stations. These measures represented a shift from emergency procedures to a routine adapted to a base that would no longer receive regular supplies at pre-raid rates. Communications reflected the altered balance. Japanese situation reports emphasized continuity of local authority, enlisted equipment recoveries and runway patching efforts, but no longer promised a rapid return to full operations. Requests from Truk specified tools, generator parts, medical supplies, and small-caliber ammunition, rather than heavy munitions or aviation fuel in bulk. American communiques reported shipping and aircraft losses with ranges and categories, rather than definitive totals, a practice intended to avoid premature claims while underscoring the operational effect. Analysts in Pearl Harbor and Washington used preliminary figures to update models of Japanese shipping capacity, projecting reduced monthly deliveries of oil and bauxite along routes formerly buffered by stage-through at Truk. Doctrine and training incorporated conclusions from the turning point while operations were still underway elsewhere. The fast carrier force refined procedures for first light sweeps, deck cycle synchronization, and dynamic assignment of airborne controllers to dense target environments. Anti-flak tactics, approach angles, altitude changes inside the 25mm envelope, and the use of staggered dive releases were codified in squadron briefings for future operations against lagoon and harbor targets. Submarine carrier coordination drills formalized the practice of queuing strike groups against ships exiting confined waters, with standardized message formats for bearing, speed, and expected egress times. For the Japanese Navy, the doctrinal pivot was a move toward dispersal and mobility. Orders emphasized the use of secondary anchorages, camouflage, and movement under cloud cover. Unit histories recorded increased training for night takeoffs and landings at satellite strips. Base defense instructions called for decentralizing power generation and communications to reduce single points of failure. Commands re-examined the placement of ammunition and fuel to reduce visibility from the air, even at the cost of slower distribution. The priority assigned to radar early warning increased, and requests for additional sets and spare parts were forwarded for bases considered more defensible. Quantitatively, the turning point can be measured by the change in relative capacity before and after the operation. Prior to the raid, Truk routinely staged destroyers, submarines, auxiliaries, and transports, supported by several hundred assigned aircraft and substantial fuel stocks. Afterward, the remaining serviceable aircraft fell to low dozens. Oilers and large repair ships were absent or disabled, and the lagoon's ability to refuel or rearm passing units collapsed. American sortie capacity, by contrast, remained intact, with replenishment at sea replacing the need for captured ports. The ratios mattered more than any single statistic. One side lost the means to project forces from a fixed node. The other demonstrated it could deny such nodes while sustaining movement. The turning point, therefore, was not only a local outcome, but a reconfiguration of the Central Pacific Campaign's geometry. Without Truk as a functioning hub, the defensive arc from the Marshalls to the Marianas exhibited gaps exploitable by carriers and submarines. Japanese convoys compelled to route through longer tracks faced more patrol days and more choke points. American planners assured that a major fleet engagement was unlikely to originate from the Carolines in the near term, committed to operations that targeted the Marianas directly, where airfields could bring the Japanese home islands within bomber range. In this sense, the decision to treat Truk as neutralized, supported by reconnaissance, lost tallies, and the observed inability to reconstitute, constituted the shift in momentum. It was a turning point defined by logistics and command choices rather than by a single battle, and it set conditions that would shape the sequence of operations through the remainder of 1944. When flight operations ceased and Task Force 58 withdrew eastward, the scene left behind was one of layered destruction and partial survival. The carriers turned into the wind for recovery, and by late 18th February 1944, the last aircraft had landed. Fuel reserves were checked, ammunition expenditure recorded, and pilots debriefed for intelligence reports that would define the formal assessment of the raid. Submarines maintained their picket lines outside Truk for several days, intercepting stragglers and confirming that no organized surface force remained in the area. Within a week, all major American units had cleared the vicinity, leaving reconnaissance flights to monitor fires still burning on the islands and the oil slicks that extended kilometers across the lagoon. Inside the Carolines, the aftermath unfolded in multiple registers: military, civilian, logistical, and psychological. The Japanese Fourth Fleet compiled a first summary listing: lost or disabled ships, 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and more than 40 transports, auxiliaries, and oilers. Shore establishments reported that most warehouses, torpedo depots, and workshops were destroyed. Power generation ran intermittently from surviving diesel plants. Ammunition stocks, once distributed to air and coastal batteries, were now limited to defensive quantities. Aircraft inventories showed fewer than 20 serviceable machines, and several of those had been moved to improvised strips on outer islands. Radio communication with Combined Fleet was re-established through weak transmissions that required relays via Palau. The strategic language of these reports already conceded that Truk had shifted from a fleet base to an isolated garrison, requiring outside supply. The task of clearing debris began almost immediately. Naval engineers and civilian laborers refloated small craft, salvaged cargo from half-sunken ships, and recovered usable metal and tools. Craters on Moen and Eaton were graded with hand labor. Pipelines were patched with sections cut from wrecked barges. Salvage parties stripped guns, pumps, and engines from grounded hulls, marking each component with chalk to record its origin before transfer to warehouses inland. These activities restored a measure of order, but did not reverse the structural loss. The base could maintain a garrison, not a fleet. Fuel deliveries now arrived in drums offloaded by lighter. Aviation operations were reduced to liaison flights when weather allowed. Medical services reorganized in surviving buildings, treating burns and wounds with limited supplies as malaria and dysentery reappeared among crews living in improvised quarters. For the Chukes population, the post-raid period combined relief at the end of bombing with the burdens of displacement. Villages closest to the airfields were uninhabitable for months because of debris, unexploded ordnance, and oil contamination. Families resettled inland, using coconut palm trunks and salvaged planking from wrecks for shelter. Food distribution relied on community stores and small gardens. Imported rice rations fell sharply. Local councils coordinated work details for clearing wells and restoring canoe channels. Despite material loss, social organization remained intact, a factor noted in later ethnographic and administrative reports compiled after the war. Death records from mission hospitals and municipal registries, though incomplete, suggest several hundred civilian fatalities, primarily from secondary fires and fragment injuries. Japanese garrison morale oscillated between resignation and discipline. Orders stressed the importance of maintaining defensive readiness and of concealing the extent of losses from outside observers. Routine drills continued, but ammunition conservation limited live fire exercises. Daily reports from battery commanders logged minor air alerts triggered by long-range reconnaissance planes, though no new large-scale attacks followed immediately. Supply convoys from the west, resumed in small numbers by late spring 1944, escorted destroyers and submarine chasers unloading provisions and removing wounded personnel. The trip now took longer and required routing through Palau to avoid submarine concentrations. What once had been a node of maritime power became a peripheral post in a shrinking defensive arc. On the American side, immediate follow-up concentrated on analysis rather than continued combat. Photographic interpretation units produced detailed charts of wreck locations, gun positions, and infrastructure damage, which were forwarded to Washington and Pearl Harbor. These materials informed Navy Department assessments of Japanese shipping losses and fuel logistics. Statistical sections calculated that the tonnage sunk at Truk represented roughly 1/10 of the total Japanese merchant shipping still afloat at the beginning of 1944. The blow to naval auxiliaries, tankers, repair ships, and supply transports was considered disproportionately significant because these were assets not easily replaced. After-action reports from Mitcher's task groups documented ordnance performance, sortie cycles, and recovery efficiency, noting both successes and mechanical issues to correct before the Marianas operations. Lessons were compiled into operational bulletins, distributed fleet-wide within weeks. The withdrawal itself demonstrated the new maturity of U.S. naval logistics. Oilers replenished the carriers on schedule, and the fleet returned to Majuro with minimal delay, ready for further operations. Personnel casualties were low, less than 100 killed or missing, and approximately 40 aircraft lost. Maintenance crews at the forward base turned around damaged aircraft within days. Strategically, the Navy now possessed proof that concentrated carrier aviation, supported by mobile logistics and submarines, could render any fixed base ineffective without amphibious invasion. This principle would guide planning for the capture of Saipan and Guam later that year. The aftermath on the Japanese strategic map was immediate. With Truk Lagoon unusable, the Central Pacific line of defense fractured. Palau became the principal remaining fleet anchorage, but its facilities were smaller and within reach of reconnaissance from the Marshalls. Supply to New Guinea and the Marianas required detours, stretching escort resources. The combined fleet dispersed its units to avoid a repeat concentration, but dispersion diluted operational cohesion. Commanders recognized that without safe forward bases, the ability to stage large surface actions, the decisive battle concept underlying Japanese naval doctrine, had ended. Internal memoranda of the Naval General Staff in spring 1944 began to discuss the need for a single decisive engagement nearer to the homeland, an idea that would later culminate in the defense of the Marianas and Leyte. At the human level, both sides faced the tangible residue of combat. The lagoon itself became a vast graveyard. Oil slicks persisted for weeks, and floating debris interfered with navigation. For months, Japanese sailors continued diving to recover materials or bodies, often without proper equipment. The sensory aftermath, smoke, heat, the smell of burned fuel, was recorded in post-war accounts by both Japanese and local witnesses as the defining memory of the event. On the carriers, debriefings combined professional pride with fatigue. Flight logs listed individual missions by time, altitude, and ordnance, a mechanical record of an action that had reshaped the Pacific theater. By early March, the operational sequence known as Operation Hailstone was formally closed. Task Force 58 resumed preparations for the next phase of the Pacific offensive, while intelligence summaries marked Truk as a non-operational base. Japanese headquarters reclassified the garrison as a local defense district, assigned primarily to observation duties and minimal maintenance of surviving equipment. The transition from battle to aftermath was therefore not only a matter of physical damage, but a redefinition of purpose, from an active forward bastion into an isolated post awaiting the outcome of a war that had moved far beyond its lagoon. Legacy unfolded along operational, logistical, and human lines that extended well beyond February 1944. In naval doctrine, the raids became a case study showing that carrier aviation, sustained by underway replenishment and guided by integrated reconnaissance, could neutralize a fortified forward base without amphibious seizure. The cycle employed at Truk, first light fighter sweeps, sequential strikes against aircraft, shipping, and infrastructure, and interdiction at exits coordinated with submarines, was reproduced with variations against other anchorages in 1944. Procedures refined during the operation informed subsequent attacks on Palau in late March, and supported the approach to the Marianas in June. After-action memoranda standardized message formats for submarine queuing, codified dive angles and release intervals within known anti-aircraft envelopes, and endorsed the practice of allocating re-attack sorties to burning or grounded targets to remove residual capacity. Within months, these methods were embedded in fleet training syllabi and planning guides. For Japan, the principal legacy was the enforced reconfiguration of the Central Pacific Defense Lattice. With Truk reduced to a garrison, convoys shifted to routes through Palau, Davao, and the Philippines, lengthening voyages and exposing tankers and transports to more patrol days along submarine lines. The loss at Truk included ships that carried specialized functions out of proportion to their tonnage, oilers, repair hulks, and stores ships, and aircraft losses that were difficult to replace quickly given pilot training timelines and airframe delivery schedules. Combined fleet adjusted by dispersing major units to rear areas, a measure that preserved hulls but complicated concentration for large-scale operations. The decisive battle concept, already weakened by attrition around the Solomons and New Guinea, lost its last forward staging point in the Carolines. Later, surface actions in 1944 and 1945 occurred in contexts shaped by this dispersal and by the absence of secure refueling and repair hubs in the Central Pacific. Quantitatively, contemporary and post-war studies converged on broad ranges rather than single figures. Cross-checked tallies credited the operation with more than 40 large vessels sunk or permanently disabled, with gross tonnage well above 150,000 and in some reconciliations near or above 200,000. Japanese aircraft losses exceeded 250, destroyed in the air and on the ground over 2 days. U.S. aircraft losses fell between roughly 30 and 50, most to flak and operational causes. U.S. personnel deaths numbered under 100. Exact totals varied by methodology. Pilot claims, photographic interpretation, and submarine verification did not always align, but the ratios are consistent. A sharp reduction in local Japanese capacity, obtained at a relatively limited cost in aircraft and crews for the attackers. These ratios entered strategic planning models used to forecast shipping availability, convoy cycle times, and the feasibility of subsequent amphibious operations in the Marianas. Operationally, Truk did not return to its pre-raid function. Follow-on strikes later in 1944 prevented systematic reconstruction of fuel storage, workshops, and airfields. Japanese reports thereafter treated the lagoon as a local defense district and a salvage depot. Technical teams removed pumps, guns, and engine parts from grounded hulls for use elsewhere. Small craft moved personnel and equipment between islands as schedules allowed. The garrison maintained observation duties and limited anti-aircraft readiness, but without the flow of tankers and stores ships, output remained confined to maintenance of local life and communications. The lagoon thus shifted from a node of projection to a terminus. The civilian legacy was shaped by displacement and adaptation. Chukese communities relocated inland from waterfronts affected by fires, debris, and contamination. Local authorities and base officials coordinated water, food distribution, and medical care, and villages resumed limited fishing as oil slicks dispersed in certain areas. Records compiled during and after the war point to several hundred civilian deaths across the islands during the raids and their immediate aftermath, with many injuries from secondary explosions and fragment effects. Post-war administration under the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands recorded infrastructure repairs and public health measures that reflected the long tail of wartime damage. Clearing unexploded ordnance, restoring wells, and reopening canoe channels remained significant tasks. Memory and commemoration took different forms. U.S. Navy archives preserved strike photos, deck logs, and analyses that are still used for teaching carrier operations and joint submarine coordination. Japanese unit histories and memoirs document the sequence from anticipation to loss, noting the impact on base functions and the subsequent dispersal of skilled personnel. Chukese oral histories and community records emphasize sheltering, relief, and the reestablishment of local routines after the raids ended. The wrecks that remain across the lagoon, transports, auxiliaries, aircraft frames, became post-war archaeological and diving sites. Local regulations developed to balance research and tourism with respect for wrecks that serve as war graves, and environmental monitoring has addressed fuel leakage and corrosion. Strategically, analysts situate the operation within the wider shift of 1944. Neutralizing Truk reduced the risk to the American advance toward the Marianas, where the establishment of airfields brought the Japanese home islands within range of long-range bombers. Japanese shipping capacity, already pressured by submarine losses, contracted further as rerouted convoys faced longer tracks and more contact days. The pattern set at Truk, air superiority established early, infrastructure and shipping targeted in sequence, and bypass of the garrison, prefigured the logic of later operations that isolated rather than assaulted certain positions when neutralization was sufficient for theater aims. The historiography includes debates about the degree to which the raid was decisive in itself, or primarily confirmatory of trends. Some studies emphasize that the combined fleet had removed its carriers and battleships before the attack, framing the outcome as destruction of logistics rather than of the capital ships. Others note that the removal of those logistics assets and the air garrison fundamentally constrained any later attempt to reassert a forward presence. Both interpretations accept the core finding. Truk ceased to function as a forward fleet base after mid-February 1944, and the Central Pacific Campaign proceeded without the countervailing pressure that such a base might have supported. In comparative perspective, the legacy can be summarized as a reweighting of time and distance. Before February 1944, Truk shortened Japanese supply lines and provided a reservoir of repair and fuel near contested waters. After the operation, distances increased for Japanese convoys while U.S. forces shortened theirs through captured atolls and mobile logistics. The result was cumulative rather than singular. Fewer Japanese ships completed cycles. Fewer aircraft could be staged forward. Fewer opportunities remained for concentrated surface action. The sequence that followed, Palau struck, the Marianas seized, and later operations in the Philippines, unfolded along lines made more feasible by the removal of Truk from the network. The long-term significance, therefore, rests on the interaction of method and effect. Carrier aviation demonstrated an operational system capable of dismantling fixed maritime nodes at range. Japanese defenses revealed the limits of static base protection without sustained early warning, fuel, and replacement airframes. Civilian communities in the lagoon adapted and later rebuilt around a landscape marked by wrecks and altered shorelines. Across archives, memoirs, and local records, the event is registered not as an isolated battle but as a structural change in the Pacific War. One base rendered non-operational, one set of shipping routes rerouted, and one theater timetable accelerated by the alignment of reconnaissance, logistics, and air power.